Wednesday morning after a 3-day weekend at 8:30 in the morning, so thanks for coming. My name is Dr. Carolyn Brocardo. I'm a toxicologist and also have extensive experience in proteomics and mass spectrometry. And this is Dr. Karen Dobos. I'm going to say something briefly.
I'm an associate professor in microbiology, immunology, and pathology, and have a dual appointment in the Research Integrity and Regulatory Compliance Office.
Okay, so we're going to talk about three very important topics today that are going to be very important to your success as you move forward, and that's good data management and responsible authorship, and also becoming familiar with research misconduct and how to avoid that. So when did you guys all get here? In the last week, or have you been here for a while? Oh, okay.
Most of us are at CSU.
Oh, you are? Oh, okay. I thought you guys were from elsewhere. So, okay, all right. And so most of you are already in a lab? Yeah? Okay. So you've maybe even been doing research for 6 months or a year, is that correct? Oh, okay. Okay, so you're further ahead than I thought. I thought that you guys were just starting this summer. So, okay. So what we want to talk about today is to kind of how to encourage you guys to be really proactive in your careers and how to think about what questions to ask along the way as related to your data that you may generate, papers that you will hopefully be able to get your name onto, and how to kind of stay on the right side of the tracks with all of this, and yourselves how to avoid getting into trouble, and also how to spot trouble that may be going on around you. So I'll just go ahead and dive right in. Having trouble getting my clicker to work, so I'm going to move back and forth. Sure. Okay. So when you join a lab, it sounds like most of you have already been with the lab for a while, but these are just some good general reminders that you might want to talk to your PI and also some senior people in the lab that you're working in about their rules and expectations in the lab. Do they want you to show up at 8 in the morning, 5 days a week, or more than that? So you want to find these out so you're not surprised later on. And who should you be reporting to? Who's your boss? Is it the PI of the lab, or again, is it someone else that you're going to be checking in regularly, and they'll kind of be looking over what you're doing and making sure that you're on track. And another thing to consider is how often do you want to meet with your actual PI, and hopefully they're sitting down with you and looking at your raw data that you're generating, and that you have an opportunity to discuss that, and also to discuss anything that you're doing with your raw data, if you're making figures and graphs, or if you have outliers and so forth, that what are the criteria for how you're going to handle all of that data. And obviously, can you take vacation? Could you take yesterday off? And what are the big goals of your project? Do you have a defined project even, or are you just kind of helping out with other people in the lab? So I want to really get that clear so that there's no disappointments down the road in that. And also, no one is perfect. We are all going to make mistakes through our careers. You're going to screw something up in the lab. You're going to put the wrong reagent in. And as soon as you realize that, it's okay to go tell somebody. Don't be embarrassed. Don't be worried you're going to get in trouble, because that's how you could get into trouble down the road, is if you realize you made a mistake, but you didn't admit it, and maybe people made assumptions based on an erroneous results. So we're going to talk about RCR today, or responsible conduct of research. And people probably wonder, what is this? This just seems like a buzzword. How does this apply to my life? Well, it really is very important. It's kind of an overarching theme for anyone that has their hands in doing any type of research. It doesn't even have to be scientific or at the bench, but just how do we do things the right way? So that's what we're here to talk about today. And all different fields have their own unique research ethics, kind of norms of the field that they need to follow. As veterinarians, you might follow one set, but then anthropologists who do very different types of research will have different levels of expectations and interactions with the people that they're studying. So what we'll talk about today is the skills that you're going to need to hopefully successfully navigate this and move forward and be really successful in whatever it is you choose to do down the road. And another important thing that you may not know is that RCR training is actually federally required. So this has become such an important issue in our nation, really in the world, that the government now requires anyone who's being paid for or funded off of a federal grant to take face-to-face RCR training. And it's quite extensive, and it covers a number of core competencies, as they call it, including the 3 that we'll be talking about today. So, and don't think that you're going to necessarily feel comfortable with all of this. You know, you might think that, oh, these ethical issues are pretty obvious. You know, I'm a good person. I know what I'm doing along the way, but you can really get into some touchy situations where it's a lot more gray than you maybe ever anticipated. So don't feel, you know, embarrassed if 3 to 5 years down the road you're still like, what is the right thing to do here? You know, how should I interact with those around me? So it's a lifelong journey, you know, and we're all continuing to learn and evolve as we grow along. And so finally, you guys will also be required to take the online RCR training modules and the mastery quiz. So that website's there. Okay. So here at CSU, you know, we always encourage our trainees from every level, undergraduates to graduate students to, you know, you guys, to take pride in CSU and the research that goes on here, but also to be aware of it. You need to know what we do here and maybe what we don't do here. You know, we choose as an institution to not do certain types of research, and that is kind of that's what makes CSU who we are. So you should understand that, and if you ever have any questions about what does CSU do we do X, and why do we not do X, you know, inquire and ask around, so that if you're out in public and someone comes up to you and says, hey, I hear CSU is doing research on guinea pigs. I think this is so horrible. Why would you do that? You should be able to stand up and say, hey, this is actually for a really good cause. We might use guinea pigs as a model, say, to study tuberculosis, and this is to help further the health of humans, and that we also do research on animals too to help further and benefit the health of animals as well. So you should be able to stand up and kind of defend what you're doing and why to the public in general. So, okay, we'll go ahead and dive into data. And this is a really big topic, and we have learned through teaching this over the years that data and authorship are the 2 main areas where the trainees really seem to struggle and don't really know how to handle it, what to do with it. Again, it seems obvious, but it's actually quite intricate, and the proper ways to deal with your data. So first of all, we'll talk about what is it? You know, it could mean a lot of things. Who owns it? Okay, is this yours and you can take your lab notebook home kind of question? How do you collect your data properly? And how do you store it so that, you know, 3, 5, 10 years from now, if someone wants to look at your massive data set, is it even going to be available or not? And do we need to really share our data, or can we just keep it to ourselves, you know, and not share it until we're completely ready to publish, or do we even ever have to share it? Are we obliged to share that? Okay. So I'll give you kind of the definition of data, and it can include many things. Measurements, you know, you might take, say, blood pressures on animals, for example. It can be materials that's created at the benchtop. If you're, say, generating recombinant protein, that could be a type of data. If you're running a gel, or you are looking at a DNA sequence, that could be data. Or it could be something like a questionnaire. Say you have clients that come in with animals and you're asking them a series of questions about their animal. That is data and also needs to be handled appropriately. Videotapes. Say you're videoing an animal, you're doing an intervention, or you're looking to see how they maybe navigate through a maze or something. That's data. Photographs can be data. It can be slides, cell lines, climate patterns, soil. Pretty much anything you can think of really can be considered data. And also custom pieces of software used to analyze data in a particular way could also be considered to be proprietary data. So, okay. So who owns the data? Who do you think? Anybody have any ideas on that? University? Great, so you guys are ahead of the curve. It's not you. The PI is the steward of the data, unfortunately. The PI is designated as a steward of the data by the government and the funding institution. But it is CSU, it is a university that owns that data in the end. And if there are disagreements between people doing the research and the PI, it's going to come back up to the university level to figure out what to do with that data in the end. And the PI, or the principal investigator, is responsible for how you collect your data. So they need to know what you're doing, and they need to be confident that you're doing it correctly and according to the procedures. And they're also responsible for safeguarding that data. So if you have extensive electronic data, you have videotapes, you have questionnaires, how is that data being stored so that someone in the future is able to access that? So that is a very important responsibility. And if you ever wonder, how is my PI handling this, feel free to just ask him and say, hey, what are we doing? How are we safeguarding our data? It might be a good reminder for them because it's often the kind of the boring part of it, and it could kind of help them to kind of get that back on their radar as to what to do. Let's see. So again, any lab notebooks that you write in, any data needs to stay in the laboratory. You cannot take it home, and we'll discuss that more later.
Okay. I think that how that becomes important is a lot of people use iPads now to collect data. It's a lot easier. It's a lot quicker to take notes. The iPad is obviously your personal property, but if you're using that device to take notes or take pictures of your data, then you have to provide a copy of everything that you've done on your iPad to the PI, and that has to be retained in the PI's lab. So although it is very nice to be able to use those handheld PDAs, especially so you can take a picture and then you can annotate the picture really quickly. That's all fantastic, and probably most PIs would encourage that in lieu of trying to remember what you did and then writing your notes down incorrectly. But remember, at the end of the day, you need to either have a printout of that document and leave it on your lab bench, or you have to store it on the PI's server, preferably, because hard drives crash, and you have to let the PI know that this is where the data is. And as a PI, I'm just going to be honest, it's better for you to be proactive and send an email saying, this is where my data is if you ever need to look at it, than to have the PI come up to you and say, where is this? Because chances are when that PI is looking for the data, they're trying to address a question or answer something or collaborate with somebody else. And if they can't find you and they can't find the data, it can be frustrating. Although it does seem like, logically, since they own the data, they should be the ones being proactive about where it is and how to access it. I'm just speaking from my own personal, I sort of assume that I'm going to be able to walk into the lab and find that data anytime. And if it's not in an obvious place, it's going to be frustrating. So if you're using a PDA, just be very conscientious about making sure a copy of that is in the lab, and be very conscientious about sending an email to the PI saying, this is what I'm using. I put a copy of it here, so you can look at it whenever you want.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for saying that. Yeah.
It's a recent
Yes.
issue
yes,
I had, actually.
Unfortunately, we learn through experiences like this that can be really frustrating. So, yeah.
What about in the case of clinical studies where we don't actually have a permanent laboratory space and we're being moved around?
So, do you have a notebook?
Yeah.
Or, like she says, a central server, within the department? No? Then maybe this is a case where you need
This
to
is a
ask.
good,
You need to ask them. This is actually a really big issue, I would say. You should approach the PI about it and see what they say. You would assume you don't have to take this to the department head. The PI should immediately realize that needs to be dealt with. So do you have a lab notebook even that you write in, or is that kind of not part of what you do?
That's part of what we're doing.
What do you do?
We're taking histories, we're taking notes on physical exam forms, we're doing a lot of video collection, and
Okay.
we do video editing that are being dispersed to other doctors.
Okay, so you have paper and video. Okay. Yeah, so you need to bring that up with them, you know, that paper potentially could be
Where
scanned
do you want it? Yeah.
in. Do they want it scanned and hard copy? That's often desirable.
Or do they have the expectation that at the end of the day, you're putting your notes somewhere, so that if they, speaking from personal experience, let's say that at 2 o'clock in the morning, they wake up with insomnia because they remembered something from some journal that they read 4 years ago, and they suddenly have an epiphany that it might relate to the study they're doing. I can tell you from personal experience that I expect at 2 o'clock in the morning that I can drive to my lab, unlock those doors, and get my question answered.
Yeah.
I think that it's going into the medical record system out of the BTH.
Okay.
Patient histories. I think that there's, is that correct, you guys?
Not for ours. It's a
Not for
separate-
yours?
Yeah, it's a separate thing.
That it should be going into a similar type system.
Yeah, I think
I would
this is
just,
a big question.
yeah, ask your PI, where do you want me to put this at the end of the day?
Yeah, see, now you know to ask. You know, that's kind of the goal of why we're here, because you maybe didn't even realize, you know, that was such a big issue. Okay. So, again, this is a federal requirement that any research you do is stored properly and that can be accessed by the PI or the government should the institution be audited. So, you do have to take this very seriously. And what do we need to do to document our data? So we're going to dive into a really big list here that may or may not apply to all of you. You know, we all have different types of data. So,
Ready?
yeah. So, what do we do with our data? Raw data should be recorded in an index laboratory notebook with permanent binding and numbered pages. So don't get a loose leaf paper and put it into a loose leaf binder. Things can be shuffled around or removed conveniently or added in conveniently at a later date. So that's really key. Go to the bookstore and get a proper laboratory notebook with numbered pages. And also you want to write down what you're doing when you do it. Don't rely on your memory. You know, we all get stressed out and busy, and your memories are going to get clouded, you know, even a few hours or a day later. You may not remember exactly what you did. So write it down when you do it. Then you can clear your brain memory out for something else that you need. And also, if you make any changes, don't just scribble it out, okay? Don't get white out. There shouldn't even be white out in a lab anywhere, okay? If you make a mistake, fine. We all make mistakes. Just cross it out with one neat line and put your initials next to it. And this could be really important for those of you doing clinical related work. Let's see. If you have that lab notebook, they do suggest that you leave a few blank pages at the beginning so that, you know, later on you can put in a table of contents and say pages 1 through 5 are this, 5 through 10 are this, so that someone 5 years down the road could go open your lab notebook and have an idea of their mind what they're looking for and quickly and easily find that. So just envision that what you're doing is not just for you, it's for other people. And you'll be surprised how many people might look back at your data. You know, I got my PhD here, and just even a year ago, I had someone come up to me and say, yeah, my PI gave me your lab notebook, and I've been going through it and using it and following it. So, and that's a really long time ago. So you never know who's going to look at your data. And you could be kind of embarrassed 10 years down the road if you did do a poor job of that. So, and don't write in crayon. Okay, if you have kids, don't go get colored pencils and crayons and bring them to work to write in your lab notebook. You need to use permanent ink and not pencil, obviously. And if you have really key notebooks, go ahead and photocopy them if you want, and then you can take those photocopies home with the original need to stay in the lab, or the photocopies could be as a secondary copy for the PI somewhere else so they can go back and look at that in the future. And it should be easily accessible too. You often hear of lab notebooks being lost, okay, under piles of crap on people's desks. They should really be in an organized location, and the PI should be able to walk right into that lab and know, oh, here's Bob's bench, and his notebook is right here. She shouldn't have to dig through a drawer or go through piles this high on his desk to find that lab notebook. Just keep that in mind from personal experience. If you generate also data, like you were saying, these questionnaires or filled out forms that don't really go into a lab notebook, that would be an example of where you could put it into some sort of notebook or filing system. So just keep all of that organized, labeled, and accessible. You know, if you have lots of loose leaf pieces of paper, questionnaires like she was saying, maybe put them in a filing system and communicate your filing system organization with your PI and with those in the lab. And really everyone should kind of follow the universal system within the group anyways, so that you guys are all on the same page. And your supervisor, your PI, should also be going back to look at that raw data. And they shouldn't, not that you have bad intentions, but they shouldn't trust you alone, because it does fall back on their shoulders in the end. So do encourage them to look at what you're doing on a regular basis. And also, you need to write down the methods of what you do, okay? Do you have an SOP? Did you follow a paper? Did you just make it up? No, that's fine. Just write it down and document it, because someone may need to come back in the future and replicate just what you did to either prove your hypotheses or for whatever reason. It's very important to write down what you did and how. Okay. Let's see. So this top one is kind of funny because, you know, what if you use an instrument to measure something and it's down the hall and you forget your lab notebook? It's like, I'm not going to go back to the lab to get my notebook. I'll just write it on this piece of paper toweling. And then you walk back to the lab and you've got all this really critical data on paper toweling. Well, it's not really great. So number one, you should try to just put it straight into your notebook. And if you can't, if it's on the paper toweling or other piece of paper, immediately write that down and double check that you wrote it correctly into your lab notebook. And also all raw data should be included, even if it's bad, even if you screwed up, you know, fine, just write it down. Here's what I got. And if 6 months later you realize you totally boofed it up, forgot to add a key reagent, go in and write that down and write a story about what happened, so people know that in the future. And you should also write it ideally chronologically. So you do it, you write it, you do it, you write it. Don't do a month's worth of experiments and then attempt to write them down in memory, from memory. It's not going to work out well. And also write down how you interpret your data. This is really key. It's the interpretation that moving forward, say, could be patentable, for example. That is your intellectual property, is your interpretation of it. So that's key, especially for getting credit in the future for a really new, great idea. You should write down those ideas you've got. And if you accidentally leave a huge blank space in a notebook, just go ahead and draw a line, an initial, and date it. You know, and say, okay, that's okay. And if you also have key correspondence and emails between collaborators, either suggesting an idea or their interpretation of your raw data, you could go ahead and print that out and tape that into your lab notebook. So it kind of makes a cohesive story moving forward. And your electronic data should also be backed up. Don't just have it on your laptop, your iPad, one hard drive. I can't tell you how many external hard drives I've had fail at our house all the time. They really only last a year or two. So they need to be backed up on some other server. CSU does have a variety of options for backing up your data, because it would just be a tragedy if you lost all your data because it was only on one location. Don't store it on a jump drive. I mean, yeah, those are not permanent storage devices. Write down your lot numbers. If you're using, say, an antibody, for example, write down that lot number, because it might behave differently than a lot you purchased in the future. And that could be an explanation for why your experiment suddenly stopped working, for example. So every little detail of what you do really should be documented. And if you have key pieces of equipment, say an analyzer for blood samples, that needs to be calibrated, and you need to note that. You know, what if someone forgot to calibrate it for a month and all the stuff is really different, and then they calibrate it later and suddenly your values are really different, and then you have these two blocks of data that look so different and don't match up. So stuff like that, just keep track of it. Okay, so if you remember nothing else from this, you can maybe remember this in your mind, ALCOA. And this is a little abbreviation that summarizes everything that we just said. A is for attributable, you know, so who wrote that information down? You need to put your name down. Legible, someone else needs to be able to read it, and this is really important. Contemporaneous, that means you write it down when it happens and have it be complete. Original information, and it needs to be accurate. So, yeah.
So is electronic data not acceptable then? Like, because what if you collect, like, all your data is done via computer?
Uh-huh.
I mean, is that okay?
Yes.
Or
I just back it up carefully on separate servers, separate locations. And also, depending on the sensitive nature of the data, it might need to be password protected and be in a system where only certain people have access to it, so that Joe Blow walking down the hall can't walk in and look at, you know,
Especially if it's
personal.
client
Right,
data. I
right.
mean, animals don't have to conform to HIPAA, but people do. So a lot of even animal client information is associated with humans, their residences, and other things of that nature. And some of the clients at the VTH are high-profile clients who do not want their information to be public. So if you have any information of that sort, you should make sure that it is preferably only maintained behind a CSU firewall on a server. The nice thing is then you can access it from anywhere as long as you can remote in, and then it's always protected, and those servers are backed up every 24 hours. So the worst case scenario, if you lose a whole, if everything goes down, if one of our servers gets hacked, is your data is going to be 24 hours old, rather than if something happens on a hard drive computer system. And then also then you're really protecting client information, because PDAs and laptops can get stolen. It's not as common as it used to be, but and the hard drives can still become ghost drives, and they get surplused a lot, and you think you've wiped them, but people can recover stuff off of wiped drives, and the potential impact is probably minimal, but if it does happen, some of the higher profile clients will be very sensitive to pursuing a complaint with Colorado State University. So you want to make sure that you're not part of that. You don't enable that to become part of your professional development. I mean, it's better to. Some of these
Avoid
things
that.
are better told secondhand than to have to experience them firsthand. So.
Yeah, kind of like you hear those stories a lot about government employees who have their laptop stolen out of their car that had 30,000 social security numbers on there. Don't be that person.
Yeah. Be like,
You're
oh
not gonna
man,
sleep at night if
it
you're
really,
that person.
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
it's better to hear those stories than to experience them.
Yeah.
Some things are good to experience firsthand, and some things are
Yeah,
not.
not that one. I don't want to learn from that mistake. Okay, what's next? So kind of to summarize it, just conceptually, big picture, stand back. When you write your lab notebook, you want to write down what you're doing, what's the rationale behind it, so what were you thinking, what did you do, what were the results, can you make a conclusion, and how would you move forward? It should be a complete story, okay? And that's easy to not do. I can say if I see that doesn't happen all that often. And let's see, kind of gets back to that intellectual property kind of idea as well. If you have a unique interpretation, write that down in your notebook so that's yours, okay? And you also want to be able to convince a reviewer or a government auditor or your PI when they come back and look at your notebook, is it accurate? Can someone replicate it? Did you provide enough information that someone else should just be able to pick up your notebook and go and do it? And is it trustworthy and reliable? And this is kind of just something you earn trust over time by being a good, careful researcher and documenting your work carefully. And it's always far better to collect and record too much data and information than too little, okay? And kind of like I said before, pretend that you're recording your data and your results and your methods for someone else, because someone 5 or 10 years from now may come back and pick up that notebook and run with it. Okay, so we're going to move on to something we've kind of already been talking about, the data storage and retention. There's different policies from different agencies as to how long you need to keep your data. It's a minimum of 3 years and going up from there. FDA is up to 10 years, and for a patent, 23 years. So it kind of goes back to that intellectual property idea. If you have a unique idea for a device, write it down, okay, and date it, put your initials next to it. I won't get into much more of the patent stuff for now, but if any of you see that you're going down that road, Linda Schuster is the in the Office of Attorney
Tech
OGC.
transfer, yeah, Office of General Counsel.
Office of General Counsel, so she's the attorney for CSU and helps out, and she also gives talks on copyrights and patents and intellectual property and so forth. She knows all about that, so that is her domain. Okay, so, and also the PIs in the university too will keep your data in notebooks for different periods of time. You might ask your PI, how long are you planning on keeping my notebooks or the raw electronic data, just to get a feel for that. And another concept is data sharing. So if your research is funded by the government, you do actually have to share that data at some point. You can't just put it in your back pocket forever. There are several reasons for that. Number one, that's taxpayer money. The taxpayers are paying for you to do research and provide a result that could be used in the future and to benefit people or animals. So that's one reason. And also another reason is to share it with collaborators or, unfortunately, even competitors. You know, science builds on itself. And so I kind of think you're morally obliged to put out there what you're doing. I'm not saying you need to put it out there right away. If you need to finish a key piece of data and then get that amazing paper out there, fine. You know, if you want to keep it in your back pocket for a little bit and not share it completely at a conference, for example, that's one thing. But when you're done, you need to get that data out there. And let's see. So, you know, again, this is a complex issue. And you do have the intellectual property considerations too. If you're coming up with a new idea, that would when you would go talk to the attorney about, do I need to share this? How do I share this? When do I share this? Because you can kind of nuance it as needed. Okay, let's move on. And another reason to share your research or share your data is that it can really increase the impact of your research and how many people will see what you do. Obviously, if you don't publish it, they're not going to see it, but it just kind of keeps going and going. And it's been shown that researchers who shared the data were cited almost 10% more than their peers who didn't. And so sharing your data doesn't just necessarily mean publishing it. You can also post it on a variety of sites, and we'll get to that next. So there's kind of many layers of how much data do you actually share. So anymore, there's really a push to publish all of your raw data, even if it's an obscene amount of raw data. You know, if from my experience, I could generate thousands of mass spectrometry runs. And how do you get that raw data out there so someone else, if they wanted to mine it in a different way for that same research question, that they could do that. So there are ways, it takes work. Okay, and other issues that we need to keep in mind is the digital preservation. Again, backing your data up on servers and maybe even different locations of servers, maybe just not one. And it's shown that the chances of data being accessible, kind of like I was just describing, huge amounts of, say, mass spectrometry data, the chances of that being accessible decline by 17% a year. You know, the computers may crash. Software versions used to analyze or view the data can change. There's so many complicated factors that can come into play. So it's important to keep that in mind and try to get your data over into a more generic, usable format for as many softwares as possible. So right now, you know, most of your data might just be, as we said, on a personal computer, a laptop or something, or maybe your department has a server, okay, and then she says, like, it's backed up every 24 hours. So that would be better, obviously, than the laptop. Go ahead. Then we'll get to why do we care? Okay, it's kind of easy to think that digital stuff can last forever, but it's really not the case. These are physical things, they're chemistries, they degrade, they break down over time, and that information can be corrupted, if not entirely lost. And so this is a neat example of bit rot, and the bits are the little bumps in there, and that's what helps to store your data. And if just a few of those 3 bits were corrupted, you can see how that text has changed. So you can imagine if more and more bits were corrupted, that's just going to be garbage, and you won't know what that is. So this is the the physical example of why we need to be redundant in backing up our key pieces of data. And another thing that we've all are familiar with is format obsolescence. Depending on how old you are, you may remember what the disk. What's that first one?
I don't even know what that
I
first
don't know.
The
Back
second
and
one's
then
a floppy
disk. I can remember back to a floppy disk, and I remember some of them being really big, and then maybe a harder plastic floppy disk. Then
zip
zip
disks.
That's what we're trying to remember. Zip disks. I remember using those when I was doing my PhD, and then you move on to CDs and DVDs and what is those big ones, laser discs. You know, all these different ways of storing data. How it evolves over time, and same thing with software. Software becomes obsolete and changes and upgrades, and eventually version 10 of Office is not going to be able to read version 5 or whatever. And so this is another thing. If you think, oh, I'm preserving all of my documents, well, in 10 years they may not even be physically readable if you keep them in that type of format. So just another thing to keep in mind, is there a more generic way you can convert those back to, so they'll be more likely to be readable in the future. Okay. Where do you put your data? Okay, so we discussed the hard drive, we discussed the departmental server, a college level server. There's another level of pushing your data out there. And that would be, you can do it within the institution, and CSU Libraries actually has another level of data storage that would go beyond your department, and is going to be really redundant. And so there's someone that you could go talk to at the libraries, and they'll give you his name. And then there's also public fora where you could upload your data. It could be federal, it could be private, open source, places where you can upload all your raw data in a more universally readable format, so people can see that in the future, and also maybe mine it for a different question. It kind of gets more bang for your buck out of those research dollars. So, okay.
And there are a lot of journals that, in addition to having a peer review process for publishing research where you have results and you state conclusions based on your results, and that's what's critiqued by peer review, a lot of those journals also have opportunities now for you to just publish your data sets, where you provide the metadata or a description of what that data is and that data set, and it then is mineable by your competitors or collaborators or a future generation of scientists. And at the same time, it can also be added to your professional curriculum vitae or career building thing as something that you put out there that can be cited and attributed to you in perpetuity. So, and it doesn't have a peer review process per se, as much as it has somebody with a data background that can look at your raw data files, make sure that they're readable, they can be converted into a more universal format so that a variety of different software programs can access them. So it's more of a communication with someone who's going to confirm the descriptive piece of your data, and whether or not when they translated it to a universal format, if it still looks genuine to you, and then make it available. And again, it is also citable. So it has an advantage to you as junior professionals who might need to re-access that data, or who might need to build upon that story years from now, as well as future generations. And then again, it also provides an additional notation on your CV of data that is now available to the public for citation.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Shay Swagger, actually, so the person here, he's our librarian who helps out with data retention and data storage. You know, he could even kind of describe what Karen was just saying as a new way of getting yourself cited. Instead of just publishing the paper and then other people citing your published paper, you might just publish a data set, and then people can go in and use your data set, then write a paper, and they will cite you. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so it's a new way, really, of getting your name out there. So we're really lucky at CSU that we have a librarian that can help out with data management issues. So you can always just go over there and meet him, or email him, and he can help you out and figure out how you should store your data in the long run. So next, you know, you've made all this data, you've hopefully backed it up carefully. What is the next step? Well, that would be maybe getting your name on a paper, right? So that, again, that might kind of seem like a straightforward thing, but there are so many nuances, so many potential pitfalls to publication. But it's also very, very fun and very exciting, and can be very rewarding to finally see your work, written down, and other people using it, other people citing it, other people building upon it and taking your ideas forward. So that's what Karen is going to talk about next, is how to do this responsibly and just be thoughtful in how we do this.
So I'm lucky because I sort of get the fun anecdotal piece. Carolyn has to do all the heavy lifting in this lecture. But I'm just going to talk about the importance of authorship. First of all, it's your academic currency. Some of you may go into professional veterinary medicine practice and you may never see research again. However, I would think that that's an anomaly because most of you are choosing to spend your summers doing research in addition to an ambitious professional veterinary program. Therefore, you probably have every intention on doing clinical research or being at a teaching hospital or somehow affiliated with an academic research environment. And while a lot of your tenure or your professional growth will be built upon your clinical service capacity, or maybe your capacity as a diagnostician or as a surgeon, if you're going to be interested in also working on that cutting edge of research and development in veterinary medicine or part of a One Health initiative, publications are still academic currency. The cliche is publish or perish, and that is still a very appropriate term today. So as recently as 2 weeks ago, I was on a promotion and tenure committee for a very ambitious young scientist who had a wealth of grants, which are very hard to get. The pay line right now in grants is around 3 to 8%, and that's after triage. So it's very hard to get federal funding right now. She had demonstrated success in federal funding, but she did not have a ambitious publication record. Obviously, she made a choice, right, between focusing her extracurricular efforts on publishing or focusing them on grantsmanship. She chose grantsmanship, and unfortunately, at the PTR review, she was not moved forward for her promotion and tenure consideration because she did not have enough publications to support her moving to the next academic level, in spite of the fact that she had a robust grant program. So it is very much still your academic currency.
How many is enough?
That's a good question. That is a really good question, and that's so tough to answer. It's very much dependent on your peer scientists, and it's also dependent on the journals that you're publishing in. So every journal has an impact factor, which is basically how many different disciplines go to that journal to learn information, to seek information. So you can have a very specialized journal that has a low impact factor because there's a very small number of scientists or professionals that are reading it. And then you have other scientific journals that have a huge impact factor because everything from an anthropologist to a medical diagnostician to a forensic biologist to a high school teacher are accessing it to get information to where their audience is as quickly as possible. So those have a very high impact factor. And then you have everything in between. So your impact factors literally go from a 0.8, which means that you'll get published in it very quickly, but it has very little impact, to a 30-plus impact factor, which are your prestigious international journals that not only have a lot to do with the importance of your research, but unfortunately have also a lot to do with politics. Who are your peers? Who do you know? Who did you graduate under? Unfortunately, for some of those higher tier journals, it's a lot of networking. The sweet spot in the impact factor is really right around a 10. Anything between an impact factor journal from a 7 to 11 is going to be where there's no politics or very little politics, where your research is very carefully analyzed and curated, and it's where most of the people in your research community are going to go to seek information to build their studies. So you'll get a lot of hits, a lot of citations, it has a good impact factor, and not only is the impact factor used, but also how many citations you have for that article. So you can get published in a great impact factor journal, but if no one's citing your data, it doesn't really have a nice cumulative score. So so it's not a set number, it's also where you're publishing and how many times your research is cited, which is why publishing your raw data files and cleaning them can be a great way to build that number, because data sets are going to be cited and accessed a lot. They are accessed and cited a lot. And it builds a, I can't remember what the factor is called, I don't quite remember, but every time that site gets, every time somebody accesses your data to look at it, you get, your name gets built up in a citation index.
The H index?
The H index, thank you.
Yes.
And that index becomes incredibly powerful, in fact more powerful sometimes than even an impact factor, because it means that you're well respected and well viewed by your body of peers. So obviously more is better, but being very careful about the choices you make for journals is also just equally as important.
So for that, like, one that you were
Mhm.
speaking of, like, how many did she have published?
That's a good question. She had, I think, somewhere between 11 and 14 publications, 4 grants, and had been at her junior faculty position for 5 years.
Wow. I
Yeah.
have to say that for me,
It shocked me.
That's, yeah, I'm
It shocked me.
surprised that that's not enough publications,
Yep,
because
I
in my
agree.
in my past experience, if I think back to, like, say, a grant that was over a 3 to 5 year period that my PI might have had, to get 3 to 5 publications off of that is about the norm.
Yep, yeah, and what's interesting is that other people in her peer body did not have independent grant support, but they had upwards of 20 some odd publications, because they had been using open data sharing to increase their citations, and they had also been more, I would probably assume, although I don't know all these people personally, had been more vocal about making sure that they were co-authors where they had contributed. And this person was probably less vocal about making sure that her name got put on journals where she contributed to the scientific body of that manuscript. So she probably really had contributed to about 20 some odd articles, but again was on about half of those because she was less vocal. She was just a more nice collegial person, and again she was thinking with my grant record, I'm very competitive, and it really actually shocked me.
Yeah, that's a sad story to hear.
It is a sad story
I
to
think
hear.
that maybe a take home from that is that there is a line between standing up for yourself and being a good collaborator. I mean, I think in the long run, I would take a lot of pride in being a good collaborator and someone that other people want to play with. But there is that line where you have to stand up for yourself to support yourself in the long run. And some fields are more competitive than others and different standards than others. There's no magical number to it, and it unfortunately can also be very political as well.
Yeah, it really is, which is why some of that data acquisition becomes very important, and which is why I get to do the fun anecdotal part about authorship. Most of the things I'm going to talk about are direct experiences. So what's very important is really understanding your expectations in the lab. All of you are in laboratories for a number of months. I don't know how you chose your PIs, or if you were assigned, or if there was some sort of competitive seeking matching process. However, you should look at the publication track record of your PI and use that to sort of get an idea of what are the norms in that laboratory. Chances are the PI has had Merrick Fellows in prior years, or a similar type of fellowship student in prior years. Did those fellowship students get on publications? Or was it more of an expectation they would contribute to an overall body of work that went into other academic processes that didn't necessarily reflect publication? And either one is okay. It's just understanding where you want to go with your future, what are the norms of that laboratory, and having very honest conversations about what your expectations are and what their expectations are. And if there's a disconnect between those expectations for publication, that's okay, just communicate it. You just communicate it directly. And if you are concerned about potential conflicts that might arise, you can go ahead and use my name. Just say, well, Karen was telling a story and she said I should talk to you. And it kind of helps, it can kind of help when there is some conflict to say, I heard this from one of your faculty peers who was disclosing personal mistakes that they made and was trying to improve upon that for future students. So that can help navigate some of those difficult conversations. But knowing those expectations sooner than later, much better. In the example of this young woman, she sort of had the expectation that one of the faculty members that she worked for at another institute would consider her for co-authored publications once she left that institute, and that faculty member did not. And that ended up hurting her several years down the road. She didn't think about it, she didn't care about it, but eventually it came back to hurt her because she didn't show this consistent, aggressive publication track record throughout her career. So ICMJE guidelines, this is actually very important because what the International Medical Journal guidelines are versus what actually happens in a lab or in an environment can be very different. So by these guidelines, which are an ethical standard, your credit should be based on substantial contributions. You obviously contributed to the data. You weren't just a pair of hands. You thought about experimental design. You drew some conclusions. Even if your conclusions were incorrect, you made an attempt to interpret and analyze that data. You had conversations. You can recognize words that you wrote. You can recognize maybe part of a sentence. Some of your PIs are going to be very, very eloquent writers, and you're going to give them something that you think is beautiful, and then when you get it back, you're going to be like, I think there's three words that match. That's okay. If you contributed to it, you can recognize some piece of it. And
we all have our strengths.
Yeah. And once you hand that baby over to somebody and it starts going through its drafting and editing process, it's going to be a big black box. It's okay to send your PI an email or stop them in the hallway and say, hey, what's going on with this manuscript? I just want to make sure, do you need anything else from me? And you might hear, oh, I submitted that last week. That's fine, because no manuscript has ever been published without some sort of minor revision or at least a proofing process. To ask your PI, oh, can I get a look at that? Can I get a look at that collated PDF? I want to show it to my mom, or I just want to look at it, or
Well, if your
I'm
name's
just
on the
curious.
paper,
If your name's on the
they
paper,
really
you have
should
that right.
have-
They should. Now
they
they
should
won't.
have given it to you before they submitted it. So yeah, your name is on that. Okay.
Many times I've pulled I'll just be honest. Many times I've hit the submit button, and then my authors will be like, hey, you submitted that. And I'll be like, yeah, here's the PDF. I'm so sorry I forgot to CC you. Especially with electronic submissions, because they're because when I finally get the chance to sit down and submit something, and I know I only have like 30 minutes, I might barrel through that and hit the send button and then be like, by the way, here it is. And at least give all my co-authors the opportunity to see that collated PDF and hit up some things when it comes to proofing. There's always going to be a little proofing process, and editors are humans. I'm an editor, and sometimes my corresponding author right before we're about to publish says, you know what, I actually need to add this author, or this is a new address all of a sudden that I want to put in there. That communication is very open and transparent between journals and PIs, so it's always okay to look at your stuff and have the opportunity to make sure that your data was represented. The other good catch-all is that sometimes, this has never happened in my laboratory, but it has happened where I have contributed to a body of work and I'm looking at what was submitted, and all of a sudden there are several names on there and I have no idea who those people were, and there's political decisions that are made to add authors. I have actually had an experience where I left an institute, I was at the CDC, and I noticed a paper that I'd contributed to where the data was in my thesis, here housed at Colorado State University, and it was now published in this journal, and my name was nowhere on that publication. And you're just sort of out of luck at that point. So be communicative, be direct. It's not a misconduct in science issue. it's a PI discretion issue. And so, again, like that young woman, she had this expectation and it didn't work out for her. It's just a missed opportunity, and you just have to chalk it up to learning. But if you are more communicative with that PI, especially after you leave the lab, the chance of that happening will be lessened.
So pick good PIs, okay? Pick good collaborators who will treat you well, and you treat them well back. Go ahead.
So the circumstance that happened with you, was that your PI didn't give the person who published the paper your, like, said that you were the author, but didn't they have to have known that to be said?
No, it wasn't my PI. It was a person on my PhD committee that I had helped them with a side project while my work was finishing. And I was training one of their postdoctoral fellows. And I think that the postdoctoral fellow provided the data to the person on my graduate committee and did not disclose how much I had contributed to it, and made that mistake. Now, why that graduate committee member didn't recognize the data that was in my dissertation, I'll be honest, I've been on committees before, and your role on a committee is to look at where you're an expert and really dig into that piece, and then you sort of peruse everything else. I mean, those dissertations are big. You got a week. You know, I'm just being very honest.
Yeah.
I probably shouldn't be, but I always am very honest. So you know, when I'm a committee member, I look at the biochemistry because that's my background, and I focus on biochemistry. If there's ecology in there or immunology, I'll read it. I like to read the background. I like to read the future directions. That's kind of fun. But I dig my teeth into where I am an expert, and I probably will not remember other figures or where I've seen those figures before in somebody else's dissertation. So I think it was the faculty member's honest mistake, and it was based on this postdoctoral researcher not disclosing exactly how much I contributed to their training and initial data set collection. So, it just, yeah, it happens. And I sort of had that sayonara attitude. Like, I'm never going to come back to Colorado State. So I didn't really, you know, I mean, not that I was bitter, but I just thought I have moved on. You know, I am a young professional, and I have moved on. And I had moved on, and in fact, I was no longer working on tuberculosis. I was working on emerging infectious diseases, and I was working on Lyme disease, and I really thought that I was going to develop my career that way. And I wasn't proactive about communicating with my former colleagues about what had happened with this postdoctoral training and research and what was going on. So, and then, you know, world is round, so, you know, yay, I'm back. A lot of times, so large multi-center groups conducting the work and identifying individuals who accept responsibility for the manuscript. Where that becomes tricky is if you're part of a genome annotation project. I don't think that probably any of you are, but if you're working on a novel infectious disease or a novel chromosomal anomaly, you might be responsible for annotating 20 open reading frames of a 4,000 piece of rudimentarily annotated genome, and you're going to know what those 20 open reading frames mean because that was what you're responsible for. When that becomes published, there may be 40 or 50 other authors on there because everybody was responsible for 20 ORFs. And there's a case where you might not recognize all the names, but you have to trust or have a very honest discussion with the PI. How are you organizing how you assigned all these? And a lot of times they'll say, oh, we had a workshop and we broke it down and here's a big table. There's usually those things are very well vetted, but they can become very problematic because in theory you should know all the authors on your manuscript, but for some of these multi-center clinical trials or genome annotations or field studies, you're not necessarily going to know all the authors, but you should either have a discussion with the PI or know your PI well enough to know they know who all those people were. Unfortunately, if you ask someone like me, I'm going to tell you some stupid story about that person, and you're going to wish you hadn't. But but it's better to feel that confidence that you are in an environment where the PIs know their collaborators, they know who's contributing to the work, and they don't mind having a discussion with you about that person. And sometimes your PI might say, I have no idea who that person is, but this guy who's my collaborator told me that they did the work and I trust them. And that's okay too. Order of authorship can become very tricky, especially when you feel like you should be the primary author and then all of a sudden you get moved to secondary author. Sometimes that can be political, sometimes that can be because a fellow prior to you that you never met contributed so much to building that initial conceptual body of data that even though you did the heavy lifting, it really was their idea that was being moved and carried forward. And that's where notebooking becomes very important, because you go back to that archival information to understand who really developed the intellectual ideas and then who did the technical heavy lifting, who put it all together. If you contribute to something as in
Donating a reagent.
donating, a perfect example. That's a great example. You made a recombinant protein, you published that recombinant protein, someone wrote to your PI and said, hey, can I have this plasmid? And the PI sent the plasmid, and they went ahead and did something else with it. You're just contributing a reagent. You should be acknowledged, or your PI should be acknowledged, but it is not realistic for you, it's not a realistic expectation for you to be on that paper. Unless they came back and said, can you make this SNP, or can you put a different tag on this recombinant protein because I need it for this imaging analysis, where then you modified it specific to that researcher's needs, then you should be. But if it's just passing a reagent through, it's an acknowledgement. I think we're good. And it's not uncommon to not know about these standards, and it's not uncommon for your PI not to totally understand these standards. Most PIs were educated by their PIs. So it's been a very sort of grim fairy tale oral tradition or discussion, and that's how most of us have been educated, is based on how our mentors were and how they educated us. So to not be fully aware of these guidelines, even for your PI to not be fully aware of some of these guidelines, is perfectly reasonable, and is also an opportunity for you to start to develop that relationship where you move from mentor-mentee to peer, because eventually you will be their peers. And you might, in fact, then move beyond them to being in a directing capacity where they are, I don't really want to say subordinate, but it's very dependent on the career choices you make, whether you're going to become their peers or become in a position of program office or directorship, where you're then directing research or administrative programs. And so the bottom line is that everyone should be open to education, even if they are currently your mentor. They should be just as open to learning about a process as you are as a mentee. Okay. Clear, concise language, accurate methods and results, relevant citations. Relevant citations is one that kills me as a PI. I see a lot of jargon and general statements, and there's no citation about it. I can honestly say that I think most mentees do not enjoy reading the literature. And it is tedious, and you're not given time for that, right? You're given time to like do, and then report. But there's this understanding that when you're not doing and you're not reporting, even though you're exhausted and you might be sleeping, you're supposed to be reading. So, and you're supposed to be knowledgeable about that literature as it pertains to your project. So, if you are about to fall asleep and you want to really expedite that process, I recommend that you have a shortcut on your cell phone or whatever to the NCBI or PubMed database, so you can look up some keywords or even your own PI and read what they've written in the past, because they're going to be very biased. You might have a result and you have a great conclusion and it might be the correct one, but they're going to be very biased by what they've published in the past. And so they're going to have their own biases into what they think your data means. And to be able to kind of predict where they're going, oh, the PI, I love you for that, right? So you read a couple of their articles, and that way you can, when you're reporting, you can actually cite them, and everybody's egotistical. They're going to be like, oh, you cited me. And I'm just telling. I mean, maybe I'm like the square.
No, I think everybody.
I think that my problem is that I have verbal diarrhea and I just say things that most people don't. But it really does bode well, because then they'll be like, oh, so you read that paper, and then at that point that actually gives you more credibility for your own independent conclusions, right? If you can cite the relevant literature and say, this result may indicate this consistent with so-and-so's previous work, and then you can follow that up with your own independent thought. As a PI, I'm going to be like, whoa, they're really smart, and they read the literature, and then they think it might be something else. I'm going to be more prone to carry that project beyond your legacy, because you have given me an idea. And because you backed it up with relevant citations, I'm going to give that more credibility than the same brilliant idea without those citations. And I'm going to be more inclined to the next fellow that comes into my lab to do a 1-year rotation to say, you know, Carolyn's work, she did a very good job. You need to read her paper. It's always good, because then you're going to get that citation notch as soon as you access her electronic data. And in her discussion, she wrote this little sentence about this one thing, and I never got the chance to investigate it, but here's her notebooks, and I think I want you to follow up on her idea. Well, that helps build your career beyond that 1 year that you spent in that person's lab. And it's all because you prepared that for the PI in a way that helped convince the PI that you are an independent thinker and a researcher, and they're going to be more, we make decisions based on the time that we have available. I'm going to be more prepared to make a decision and to take my risk over to this path where I feel like there's a good paper trail than I am to somebody else who has the same brilliant idea, was just going off the cuff and just wasn't packing in some data alongside of it.
Yeah. And I'll just say one more thing too about the literature searches. Depending on what kind of research you're doing, you might be doing some kind of exploratory hypothesis generating thing, and you might end up with huge lists of data. And how do you make a story out of that? You know, this is what your career might be resting on. And so, you know, I've had a lot of publications that were like that, and I just went home for weeks and read the literature and wrote the paper. And it's only through diving in and reading and reading and reading and being creative, and one little thing will click in your mind, and you'll take that and you'll run, and you might be able to put together what seems to be a bunch of disparate pieces of information into a really interesting, cohesive story that your PI and group can then run with for years. So that's kind of, I think, the fun part of it, and it allows you some creativity. So, you know, don't dread reading the literature. It can really be fun and exciting, you know, especially if you can contribute just a little bit of creative thought and synthesis to that.
Right, synthesis, that's a
Yeah.
let's see, acknowledging sponsorship, that's usually your PI's responsibility. Where did the money come from, basically? Conflict of interest, again, that's usually a PI thing. They might be a consultant for a biotech company, and that might bias them in some way, so that it's their responsibility to disclose those conflicts. You can always ask your PI, but those conversations usually don't happen. You usually have to trust the PI to understand conflict of interest. Most of that is a financial backing. Like, if I think that pushing this research forward may in some way increase my consultancy for this biotech company, and that consultancy is paying me a consultancy fee, which I've vetted through tech transfer at CSU, or on my own as my little LLC on the side, I have to be aware that I might be indirectly padding my own pocket, and I have to disclose that. And I have to be very honest about that to whatever, if I'm the one publishing, or if I'm on a publication, or if I'm reviewing a publication, and it might help me indirectly to disclose those things as a PI. That's usually the responsibility there. Professional COI would be, I think, again, not very common, but I think that has like a historical context with graduate advisors, maybe having their graduate students also babysit their children, water their plants, take care of their house, those types of relationships that were not really all that uncommon in the not too distant past, but not really common anymore, because a person in a mentee relationship is always going to subconsciously want to please their mentor. And so you might go out of your way and do things that if it didn't have a advantage to pleasing the mentor, you wouldn't do. So that's really where COI is, not really an authorship responsibility for a mentee. Duplicative publication. This is an important one. Most of your PIs do review articles. They might do chapters for books. Those are great for a PI, but they have a terrible citation index for a mentee. Book chapters do not help you at all. Reviews do not help you that much because of the way they are cited. They don't contribute to your H factor or your citation index as well as a primary research article. So they're given a fraction of a point versus the full point that a primary article will be given. Great for PIs, not so great for mentees. So here's where it becomes important. Your PI made an agreement to write a chapter 2 years ago that is now past due. You're in the lab and they say, hey, do you want a writing opportunity? And you say, yes, of course I want a writing opportunity. So they give you that opportunity so they can meet those goals. That's perfectly fine. Where it gets tricky is you're writing a chapter and you're also doing the primary research at the same time, and in your head you might be thinking, what if I put a little bit of this primary data in? I don't know if it'll ever get published, but I'm going to put it in this book chapter or in this review, which is perfectly fine. The problem is once you put it in that, even though it's not a peer-reviewed article, you cannot use it for a primary research article. So be very careful about contributing to reviews or book chapters with primary data, because you're going to eliminate the possibility of that primary data being published in a primary research publication. So that's where it becomes very important. Now, if you know for sure this data set's never going to be moved forward, great way to get some data out there. If it's just a little teeny little side study and you know that it's not going to be applicable, especially if you've already published the primary article and that got on the cutting floor, which can happen, then that's a great way to move that data over. So just be careful about duplicate publications. Protecting intellectual property rights, that's again where data acquisition is very important, because if you don't properly annotate and document your data, you may be missed from a future IP opportunity. And IP moves very slow. Patents move very, very slowly. So, and it's often a huge body of work that contributed to the patent. I'll sit down with a patent attorney and they'll ask me, who contributed to this work? And the thing is, I tend to put down everybody. But that attorney will go through and make me document exactly how much they contributed. And part of the reason why, although the work that I do does not generate an income, some IP work will generate a royalty, which will generate a substantial income for the university. The university will take a certain percent, and then the university is responsible for partitioning out all like about 30 some odd percent based on how your IP was written will go directly to the PIs and the collaborators. The PI can choose to roll it into their lab. That has a huge advantage. Or the PI can choose to personally profit from that IP. So if I list 40 people, that attorney is thinking, if this is a money-making thing, which again, none of my stuff ever is. But I've still had these conversations with lawyers where they want to know exactly how much what percent did they contribute? Was it 5%? Was it 20%? And because they're going to make decisions about if there's a royalty that comes in, how are we going to manage and distribute that royalty? And how are we going to find these scientists so that they can make the decision, I want that to roll back into the CSU Research Fund because I had a great experience at CSU and I want to build that venture capital research fund. And you just send me a statement at the end of the year that says how much I contributed for my taxes. They're going to have to do all those communications. So having documentation and being aware of your potential in IP years down the road is very important. Again, I think I already talked about this, authorship order, having those discussions with your PI, making sure they're having them just be very nice and very polite and very innocent. Like I think, would you want me to take the lead on this as the primary author, or do you want me to work with so-and-so and this lab and we can share putting this together? Those types of nice conversations sort of indicate where that authorship order is going to go, missing authors, and then extra authors. I have a sad story about missing authors. I had a great undergraduate student named Cassie Cotton, and she got an internship at the Ohio State University for the summer, did a summer undergraduate research program. She came back, finished her bachelor's degree, went on to pharmacy school. I lost touch with her. Ohio State University came back to me and said, hey, we're finally publishing some of our work that Cassie contributed to. We want to consider her on this publication. We want her to, do you know where she is? And I couldn't find her. The alumni, actually the CSU alumni, who can usually find anybody, anywhere, could not find her, which is shocking.
They'll call you
actually.
at 7 o'clock at
They
night.
have no, I mean, that's amazing. They're better than like the FBI, how they can find people. But in this particular circumstance, they couldn't find her, which is why I'm saying her name out loud in case anybody knows her. But so unfortunately, they could not, they owned the data. The PI of the Ohio State University, Larry Schlesinger, he owned the data, so he had the right to publish it without her name. He did his best to try to find her. We tried to find her. We didn't. So unfortunately, there's a very nice publication that includes some of her work that doesn't include her. And so, again, keeping that communication up, here's my new address. Unfortunately, that does mean like updating your address with the Alumni Association, because they can help a PI find a person. Sending an email to the PI is a great idea, but we're going to probably lose that email. Sending us a completely unprofessional, nondescript Christmas card is a really great idea, or holiday card, or whatever, end of the year card, I don't know, call it whatever you want, because that's actually a hard piece of mail that we probably will keep on our desk under something for a while until you send us the next one, and then we can actually know where you are. Hypothetically speaking. Don't check the back of my car. Anyway, so again, upfront discussions and expectations. Authorship contracts or agreements, I've heard of these. I have never seen one.
No, I've never seen one either. Never been party to anything so formal.
Yeah, when I was at Emory, we were working with a lot of MDs, and they would have these discussions. And as a researcher, we hadn't even started the research. And they would all come together at a table and be like, well, so-and-so is going to be the lead, and Karen, you'll be third author, and da-da-da-da, and this will be corresponding. And I thought, that's so crazy. What if we never publish this? What if this sucks and we never get, but we now know our authorship order. So there are some people that are very, very formal about it. Most academic researchers are a little bit more loose. That was a very formal environment that I was in. But as your research develops, especially if you have results that seem to be exciting, they seem to be something your PI cares about, having a discussion about expectations and authorship and who do you want me to talk to build this are very important conversations to have. Always try to work with the PI and the senior people in the PI's lab. If the PI is somebody who's not around a lot, there's probably somebody that PI trusts a lot that you can go and talk to and say, hey, I'm having some difficulties, kind of understanding what so-and-so wants of me. I think it's this. You know this person. What do you think? I don't really recommend that passive-aggressive kind of conversation, but if you're having a hard time getting a hold of the PI because they're somewhere, they go do an international study, or they're on a sabbatical and you're just having an issue, talking to somebody in that lab that's a manager or a senior researcher or research scientist, and just sort of helping understand the writing process is always a good thing. You generally always want to solve your issues with that lab, because you don't know what's going to happen 5 or 6 years from now, and nobody ever wants to burn a bridge. However, if that is unsuccessful, going to a department head or a dean, or here at the university, the ombudsman is a great way to handle potential conflicts in a very confidential manner. And that might happen. And the other thing is, no matter what's going on with you personally, no matter how passionate you feel or how hurt you feel, or whatever kind of emotions you may have, this is a good time to stuff it and keep that conversation to credit and responsibility. What did you contribute to? What are you responsible for? What do you feel are the responsibilities of the PI, and where is there a disconnect? Because that will help the institutional officials make sure to vet your conversation based on hard information and not just how I am feeling at this moment.
You could go refer back to those ICJME guidelines and say, I contributed X, Y, Z. I thought of all these ideas. You know, that's
Mhm.
the hard and fast rules you can always
Yeah.
get back on. You know, like she says, to disconnect emotionally from a stressful situation.
So peer review, this is we almost nixed these slides, but what I wanted to stress about peer review is that what I have seen from mentees when they get back their revisions from a peer review process is an interesting set of emotions. And it is because you're very passionate about that work. And what that peer might say might sound very cutting and mean, or it might look like they didn't even look at your results and just sort of wrote their discussions based on their own ideas. And some of that might be true and some of it might not be true. But the important thing is to try to read those in a frame of mind where you can pull something positive from it. Sometimes a peer reviewer is just a jerk. And a good peer reviewer who knows they have a conflict of interest will bow out of that review process, but that doesn't always happen. So sometimes you will get that reviewer that's just a bit too negative. But even in that review case, try to find one little gem where you can improve that paper so that you can focus your response on that positive aspect. You want to draw that reviewer in no matter who they are, and you want to try to get them onto your side. Thank you so much for your critical comments regarding, I understand that you might have misinterpreted, figure 2A, B, and C, and not necessarily seen those bright red arrows. I have, but to try to make it incredibly positive. Like, I have corrected this. I'm so happy you brought this to my attention.
You have to eat this slice of humble pie.
You do,
so to
because you
speak.
just want to get published.
Yeah.
That's your goal.
Yeah.
And most peer reviewers are actually trying to help you have a better publication. Most of them really are. You know they are when they start giving you citations because of that whole not reading the relevant citations thing. When they start saying, you should include the work of blah, blah, blah. Now, sometimes that can out a peer reviewer because, again, we're all egotistical and we're going to tend to cite ourselves. So you might go, oh, I know you reviewed this paper because you told me to publish you, or to cite you. But oftentimes it's just that they know that body of research very well, and they are actually just as excited about you about getting this out, and they want to make sure that it's well read and well received. So you have to consider peer review in that positive light, even though some of the negative stuff might happen.
Yeah. I'll get those peer reviews, and like she says, for maybe a day or two, you feel a little bit angry and insulted and whatever. That's fine. Read them over. Don't start addressing them until you're in a positive mental space, and I think that's really normal, and it's good that you bring that up. So get your anger out and move on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's where you can actually have good, fun bonding experiences with your co-authors and PI.
Right.
Where you can get it all out,
Yeah.
and then be like, yeah, but it was kind of, I do like the fact they said this.
Mm-hmm.
And then
There's usually nuggets of gold.
There's
in
always
what
a
they're
nugget. There's always a
saying.
nugget in there somewhere. Even if the nugget is the next time we publish this, we're going to put them on the do not review list, because sometimes, I will know my reviewer based on the fact that they do not want me to get this information out, and then in revision, I can say, you know what, I don't know who the reviewers are, but if this goes through review, will you please exclude this group? I think they have a conflict of interest that they did not disclose. They are working on the exact same thing as me, as evidenced by this and this and this citation. And the editor will go, okay, and they'll cut them out because it was a COI that wasn't disclosed. So, yeah, we're good.
Okay.
And then this is a fun thing that happens. You're in your PI's lab, and they've already committed to reviewing a paper that they forgot that now is due, and they're going to come up to you and they're going to say, hey, I know you want to be a young professional soon. You know what's really important is learning about peer review. Will you review this paper for me and just kind of give me your thoughts maybe in like a document?
Formal document. With my name on the bottom.
Yeah, and especially if you could in that document include line numbers and stuff. That would be really awesome. So, so that whole respond within the allocated time frame is
Yeah.
kind of
And that's
tough.
not appropriate if your PI does ask you to formally review a paper for them. That's not okay. Yeah. And you're supposed to technically not even read it, although sometimes people think it's a learning experience to do that. You are kind of crossing some ethical boundaries by even having your students look at that.
See how she's the heavy lifter in
Yeah.
RCR, and I'm like,
yeah. Like it's not right.
I can
know
change
it
my
goes
hat.
on.
I can be like, I got my RCR hat, but right now I got my PI hat on, and
Yeah.
Carol is
yeah.
trying to keep me honest.
That's right.
Well, I am being honest. She's trying to keep me.
Yeah.
Yes.
So if things like that happen, what do we do?
Out of trouble.
If
What?
like if we're asked to do that, or if we're asked to write the chapter.
Do you want to know
of
what's
the book,
appropriate?
Yeah, like what's appropriate.
What's
not
appropriate for
get
me to do
passed
as a
out loud.
PI is to respond to that editor and say, "Dear editor, I do not have time to review this. However, I recommend you send that to said student. Here's their email. I bet you they'll be happy to review it." And then you become a formal reviewer, and you are formally responsible for reviewing that. That is what really should happen. That does not always happen. So if you're going to use it as a learning experience, here's the appropriate gray area. Hey, I have to review this paper. It has a lot to do with your research. This is a confidential piece of information that you cannot share with anyone. I would like you to give your initial critique of it as a learning experience and also to help you understand where the field may be going. But you really have to treat this as confidential. I don't want you to talk to so-and-so about it, and I want to make sure when you're looking at this document, you don't leave it in a place where so-and-so can come and look at it and read it. And then I want you to tell me what you think about this paper. And then you and I have a discussion about that paper, and you tell me your criticisms. I'm still going to review it. I've taken a little bit of a shortcut, right? That's the gray line. I've gotten a little bit of a shortcut because I'm making you do the heavy lifting. But then you and I are going to have a conversation about that paper. And you're going to say, do you know what happens when a person is first reviewing a paper? You tend to be overly negative. You tend to be, junior peer reviewers are very critical of the work because they're criticizing it from their point of view at this level, right? So most junior researchers are the most critical of their data. They believe their data the least, they trust their data the least. That's a great spot for your head to be in, and that's where it should be. You should feel uncomfortable when your PI is excited about your work and wants you to start writing it. And you should feel compelled to repeat that experiment one more time. And if that's how you feel, you're feeling perfect, right? So as a reviewer then, you're going to review that work with that same critical eye that I don't have anymore, because I've been buying into faith at some point in time. And you're going to sit down, you're going to be like, I don't like how they did this experiment, I don't like how they did that, and you're going to have a usually overly negative criticism, which is also why it's not good for you to be a reviewer at this initial stage of your career. But then I'm going to be able to talk to you and go, yeah, you're right, but you know, we used to do these things this way 40 years ago, and I remember even having to learn this as much as 20 years ago, so I think they're just building upon this. I really like what you have to say, but I'm going to buy in a little bit to what they're doing, but I think I think what you're saying is very critical, and I think it might mean this. And we're going to have a conversation. It's going to help you become a better reviewer. It's going to help you understand your research and maybe build a little bit of confidence on it, confidence in yourself. It's been a very positive process. But in the end, I'm going to be responsible for that review, and as a courtesy to you, I might send you my review document in confidence, or I might show it to you and go, here's the critique that I wrote. Thank you so much for your comments. They helped me really identify some core areas that could improve this piece. You did a great job, and I thank you so much. But just remember, this is confidential, and when as soon as this hits the press, you're welcome to talk about it. But until then, let's make sure that we respect this other person's right to privacy. That's what really should happen.
Yeah. And it's kind of a dangerous zone, this confidentiality, because as a peer reviewer for the paper, it's hard to, you read it and it's in your head. You can never remove it. Mm-hmm. And especially if it's really closely related to what you're doing, gosh, you have to be careful to not build on what you just read in your own experiments or use that in a grant application, for example. Highly inappropriate. Mm-hmm. So you have to learn how to disconnect, although you can never get it out of your head once you've read it. It's
right.
there. So.
And there are some times, quite honestly, where it's in my head and I'm like, when is that frickin' paper going to be published? Because that's going to help me publish my paper.
Yeah.
And I'll actually like even leave little parentheses for the reference, and I'll just like keep hoping, and I'll keep hoping, and then it'll come to a point in time where I've got to submit, darn it, because like my graduate students yelling at me because they want me to submit. It's more important to them to have a publication at this point in their careers than it is for me to have one. So they're going to push me to go ahead and move that forward. Then I'm going to take that paragraph that I love about that paper that I know is going to happen, and I'm going to remove it, and then I'm going to put this other thing forward, and I'm going to actually hope that one of those reviewers is the person that was on that paper, and that they'll know where they are in the citation, and that they'll let me reintroduce that discussion. And that has actually happened, where I knew a publication was going to come out. I reviewed it. It was beautiful. I put minor revisions because I wanted it to get out. I mean, it was a great piece, it was a great paper. It was a cell micro paper. It was amazing. The fact that I had the opportunity to review it was just a shock. I think they were desperate, but it was going to help me publish so much. I just wanted that dang paper to come out, but instead I had to remove those discussions. It was in another version. Our publication came out. Sure enough, one of the postdocs in that person's lab reviewed it and said, you need to be aware of this work. And it was great because their work came out, and I just shoved the paragraph back in, and it was a win-win situation. So it is kind of great. It's really great. Ooh, I'm done.
Break time, guys. Does anybody know what time it is?
10.
It's 10.
10:07.
See,
10:07.
I
Oh my
overtalked.
gosh.
Yeah,
Okay,
screw
5-minute break. Potty break.
You gotta like put a shot collar on me.
Today, we're going to talk about research misconduct. And it's been shown that about 1 in 10 scientists will manipulate data to some degree. So given the high level of collaborations nowadays, both within the U.S. and even outside of the U.S., where it's harder to really know what's going on if your collaborator is out of the country, it is likely that you will somehow be touched by this at some point in your career. So, okay, so what I'm going to go ahead and do is I have a handout here, and I'll just kind of pass these around. You guys can just pass these around. This is what you really need to remember. Okay, that's on this piece of paper here. So what is the definition of research misconduct? Okay, it's fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism, otherwise known as FFP. So if you can remember those 3 words, fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism, that seriously deviates from those that are commonly accepted within your field for proposing, conducting, reviewing, or reporting research. Okay, so it's very specific there, and that it has been committed intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly. And recklessly can get you in trouble. Okay, and it has been proven by a preponderance of the evidence, so more likely than not. So what is key here is that misconduct does not include honest error, okay, or honest differences in interpretations or the judgment of your data. Okay, so this sounds hard and fast, but there can be a lot of gray areas here, okay, and so I'll hit back on to number 1 here. So, comment, that seriously deviate from proposing. So this could include a grant application, okay, not just a publication. So if you put in a fabricated piece of data into a grant application, very serious. And so I'll just go ahead and highlight too what the difference is between fabrication and falsification. Fabrication is when you just flat out make up data points or data sets, okay? Falsification might be if you have a few outliers that are really bugging you, then you just tweak them a little bit so they fall on that line and you can get that R-squared better, okay? That could fall into that category there, okay? And then as I said in number 2, recklessly is where you can get into trouble here. It's not an honest error, but if over time you are so careless with how you manage your data, for example, you walk down the hall and you write down those key pieces of information on paper toweling, and you don't date them or write what they are, and you have a stack of paper towels on your lab bench, and people come back to see what the heck you've done, they can't, you can't say anything. That has crossed from just being careless, from, oh, I forgot to write down what I did a couple of times, sorry, to over a 2-year period, I was very reckless with how I stored my data. Okay, so that would be an example of crossing the line. And number 3 has been proven by a preponderance of the data. So how much do you think that means? What percentage of sure do you think that means? Does anybody have a guess? 75%? 99%? 51%, okay? The bar is low, okay? They only have to be 51% sure that you did one of these things for you to be, land yourself in some serious trouble. Okay, so are you guys, could you guys be accused of misconduct? Could an undergraduate be accused of misconduct? Yes, they certainly could. And how it would be handled within the system would depend on how they were being paid. If they were not being paid under a federal grant, for example, they were being paid under startup funds from their PI, they would not be subjected to kind of the federal level of research and misconduct, and it would be more academic misconduct. And they would also not be referred to our department, RCR, for research misconduct. So it kind of depends how you're funded there, but they're obviously both very serious allegations, and you don't want to land yourself in that. Okay. So I don't want to get into too many details of this, but there is a formal process. If there are allegations of research misconduct, and they'll be different whether it's academic misconduct or if you're being paid off of federal funds, there'll be very specific things, and it's all confidential. Unless you're found guilty of research misconduct at the federal level as well, and the NIH's Office of Research Integrity releases your name to the public. And they do put out a list every few months of people who they have found guilty of research misconduct. And so obviously that could really harm your career. So, okay, don't want to go there. Okay, we can move on from that too. Okay, so as you as a student or as a PI, what can you do to try to keep out of hot water? You know, most of us really have good intentions, and most of the people that end up in these situations didn't really plan to get there, okay? They said, oh, I didn't know I had to do this. You know, my boss never told me I shouldn't do that, so I got rid of that piece of data because it was an outlier, okay? Their intentions most of the time are not, I'm gonna make all this up and see if I can sneak this through. It's those subtle gray areas that are a lot more likely to get folks in trouble. So again, you know, go back and look at that raw data, communicate with those around you regularly, document what you're doing, and the PI and you, if you're kind of a senior person in your group, look at the raw data, okay, and think about FFP, fabrication, falsification. Or even something more subtle than that is does this person even know how to properly analyze their data? Again, kind of the outlier question. You know, it may not be intentional what's going on, but it's your responsibility to make sure that it is accurate. Okay. Okay, so what can you do to protect yourselves? You probably have never even, well, maybe you have, maybe never heard of the Graduate and Professional Bulletin. And this would outline kind of your place in the CSU system, and how can you be fired, how can you be hired, and unfortunately students are kind of at the bottom of the list, and you guys unfortunately are easier to get rid of than say a faculty member. So you all guys are a lot more vulnerable, so it's important that you really just pay attention to this and document, okay, and hold meetings with your PI and your advisors regularly, so there's no surprises about what's going on. And if you do ever suspect something funny is going on in your group, you know, there's a lot of resources. You can talk to your PI, the department head, you can come to the Research Integrity Office and talk to some of us, and it can all be confidential. So, okay. Okay, so I'm going to get into kind of an interesting example here. I won't delve too deeply into this, but this is a real case of research misconduct. It's actually still being adjudicated at the NSF level. And what happened is there were some chemists, and they published a paper saying that they did this. Okay, this experiment worked, and we saw this. It's really unique, really cool. Okay, one of the collaborators, whose name was on the paper, said, "Wait, I'm not sure I believe your data." Okay, and he was doubting a graduate student's data. And so they went back to her lab notebooks. Her lab notebooks did not support what she claimed in her publication. In fact, it kind of supported the opposite of what she published, right? And so this could have been intentional or not. You know, this could have been reckless, getting back to reckless record keeping. Maybe she didn't write things down. She forgot to write down a key experiment, and then the one she wrote down was the one that failed and showed, or I should say failed and showed the opposite result. So this is an example of a graduate student trying to get her PhD involved, and here it is, I think 8 or 10 years later. It's still up in the air. She did get her PhD, I think you can go on, and she worked for the NIH for, you know, a good 5 years, and now she's jobless for a couple of years. She can't, yeah, go ahead. People don't want to touch her because in very minimal effort, you can go out and get the people's pictures and names and where they're at that were involved in this. There's numerous articles out there. You can read about the entire case of this. So it's not private. If you do get involved in something like this, even if you didn't really do anything wrong, like I said, maybe she was just careless in the way she did her lab notebooks. We don't know. This is affecting her career, this Lena here. So, experienced biomedical researcher seeking new opportunities. You don't want to be that person. So just take care of yourself, you know, and the group that you're in, pay attention to what's going on. Yep.
So if you're documenting along the way, like, your intellectual progress, don't you have to be careful with that as well? Like, because you can't really, like, just make conclusions in your lab notebook, because that could be seen as, like, right? Like, you have to be really subjective about it.
I think you could write down conclusions that you have. What are you concerned about? Give me some more
No,
information.
it's just like I was reading up about keeping a lab notebook, and they said, yeah, like, it's good to just kind of document your progress, but you have to be really careful about making conclusions in your lab notebook.
Huh. I would be okay with making conclusions, and I think it's actually wise, because if you have a great idea, you've documented it, and it shows, again, it's back to your interpretation of your data and of your experiments, and that's what you go on to publish. You don't just put most of the time, raw data out there. A publication, a peer-reviewed publication is going to have your interpretations, conclusions, and future directions, and if you don't want those potentially stolen from you, I think you should put them down actually in your lab notebook.
But I can see the concern being you put down a conclusion, your PI gets excited, and they publicly disclose it at a conference or to a collaborator. And I had that personally happen where the PI was just way too excited about my data. And I felt the need to be more cautious about what I was putting down in my notebook. But unfortunately, I can't control how my PI is going to react to my data, but I am in control of the integrity of my data and what I think about it. And it's better to document your data and document your thoughts than it is to sequester that information, because if you sequester that information and your PI moves forward or somebody else moves forward and you're like, man, I had that idea, you no longer have ownership of it. And for most, the only thing that we really own is our thoughts. Everything else is public domain, especially if we're funded by federal funds. So to put down your thoughts or your conclusions or what you think is happening, I would say it's better to take that risk and then having an overzealous PI prematurely present that information. They won't be able to publish it until you've solidified it, and then it'll go through peer review, and if nobody likes your conclusions, they'll catch it. I'd rather take that risk with that PI being like, that's great, I'm gonna put this in my grant, and you going, oh, okay, than the risk of not putting the information down and then not being able to be a part of future intellectual capacity.
The only thing I'll throw out there is that if you have ideas and you're doing research at home in your garage that are not being federally funded or not doing it at CSU, you could have a separate lab notebook and you would write down your ideas there and keep it separate from your CSU work. That would be if you're doing something proprietary or thinking up a new device or something, or you have a PCR machine in your garage. You know, I don't know. It could happen. So,
Lots of great things have been built in a garage.
That's right, Steve Jobs, right?
Right.
So, yeah. Do you guys have any questions? You know? No? No deep thought questions. What time is it?
7:26.
Okay. So if in general you guys ever have any questions or you get into kind of a questionable situation, just know that you can always call any of us over at Research Integrity. Kathy Parton is the director, Karen Dobos is the associate director, and I'm the responsible conduct of research coordinator. So, you know, our goal today was to just give you information, okay? So if you ever get into a questionable situation, whether it's with how do I store my data, how do I record it, gosh, I'm having an authorship dispute, you know, what do I do, okay? So we're just giving you the tools to run and to move forward with your career successfully and ethically,